speaking of beautiful, what a day outside in Toronto right now, eh? Holy shit.
Yeah, my Plato senses are tingling.
It's 14 degrees Celsius out there, and for you Americans, you do the fucking conversion yourself.
Yeah, it's like 98 degrees Fahrenheit.
Is this the time when I feel perpetually on the edge of being sick, but like not quite sick?
Man, you just had COVID, bro.
I know, but like it's just this time of year. I feel like I could get sick again because the temperature changes.
Eric, you're dragging us down. We're here to discuss the true, the good, the beautiful, all of which find their true idea is realized in our topic today, Christofascism.
Yeah, Christofascism.
Yay.
And there's a wide range of Christofascism we could cover. We're doing kind of the tame end. But before we get to the tame end, did you guys see the tweet complaining that Netflix made Alexander the Great gay?
Oh my God, that was good. I believe I sent it to you, actually. So yes, I saw it.
Yeah.
They don't have to know that, Victor.
That is true. Now we're constructing the narrative. We're not.
Yeah, we're constructing a narrative. Hey, did you see that thing that you sent me?
No, what did I send you?
Alexander the Great would never be gay in a Christian society.
I know. It's pretty amazing. And I have to say I don't know if impressed is the right word, but maybe just a little bit relieved that most of the comments, I feel like, or at least the most like upvoted comments, were kind of like, hate to break it to you, or like, oh, like I guess you haven't read about the Greeks, eh? Whoops.
Yeah.
I still remember Zack Snyder. We did an episode psychoanalyzing the Oedipal symbols in one of the Zack Snyder movies.
The Snyder Cut.
He is the most hetero filmmaker for sure. So the hetero did hetero revisionism by making the Spartans anti-gay and anti-pedophile.
Oh yeah, in the movie, that's right. And like the Spartans
were not like the boy lovers over in Athens.
Yeah, it's true.
Boy lovers.
And it's like it was a huge fucking hot masculine orgy.
The Spartans are arguably the most pro-pedophile gayest society in history.
By the way, not at all to suggest that those two things are connected, just in case anybody gets mad.
Not naturally, anyway.
If you want to look up the terms like pederasty, that's where you should start your research.
Yeah, exactly.
The only competition that the Spartans have for being gay pedophiles is who we're talking about for the rest of this episode, which is the Catholic Church. Of course, yeah. Number one and number two. Well,
actually, just a quick comment, though, about like sort of recent right-wing reactionaries on Twitter. Like, I think about that guy, Bronze Age Pervert, Bap. If you follow him on Twitter, like he's always posting these like hyper masculinized and even shit like Andrew Tate. Like I feel like there is some sort of a weird, like a kind of subtle homoeroticism like implicit in all of like the way that they talk about things, the way that they like kind of hold masculinity up, and like Bronze Age Pervert, for example, he's always showing like he's always posting pictures of like jacked, like greased up, like six-pack dudes, and it's like as like this symbol of like optimal masculinity. And it's just like I feel like there is this like subtext, some kind of a homoerotic subtext on some of the far right now anyways.
The subtext is kind of like you have to be gay to want to have sex with a woman because it's too
exactly
they're too fragile.
It's too beta.
I mean, listen to this. This is an article I found from 2004 on Oliver Stone's new Alexander movie. And this one was published in China Daily, but I see a bunch of others that strike a similar tone. Oliver Stone's new film about Alexander the Great depicts the king as bisexual, fueling outrage from Greeks and prompting Hollywood to ask if a world conqueror with dyed blonde hair and waxed legs will be able to attract box office hordes. One newspaper calls it the queer eye for the Macedonian guy. Others have speculated that Oliver Stone, always a controversial filmmaker, is taking a big risk with a $160 million epic by including scenes of passionate embrace between Alexander and his best friend Hephaestion. Yeah.
This was Colin Farrell, right?
Yeah, it's a Colin Farrell version. Yeah. He starred as Alexander the Great. The Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation says the film breaks new ground for a big budget epic because it shows Hephaestion as the true love of Alexander's life. So you can see the same conversation just running on repeat again today.
I think Jared Leto was Hephaestion, right?
I don't remember, but I remember it being a bad movie.
It was bad. They were trying to go off the Gladiator energy, and it didn't really work so well.
It did kind of drag on, and I think there was some dong hanging pretty quickly in the movie too. That's culture, right?
God, as if the Greeks got mad.
He wasn't technically Greek, right? Macedonian.
No, he was Macedonian. What did the Greeks get mad about recently? Oh yeah, they also got mad about the Cleopatra thing on Netflix. They depicted her as black recently, and like a bunch of Greeks got mad. And initially, the reason why I didn't feel like it's as bad is because they also, if you go way back and look at, I think it was Audrey Hepburn who played Cleopatra in like the really old movie. Could be mistaken.
Yeah. Golden Age.
And so they were consistent. So they also got really mad back then because they're like, she wasn't that white.
You can go all the way back to Black Athena, the
she was Macedonian too.
Roots of classical civilization. Martin Bernal, 1987.
Back to the theory arc. If you've been listening to us, we are on an arc of the end of history. And Fukuyama, everybody knows. And now and again, with all these readings, again this week when I was doing them, he's described as a triumphalist like 90% of the time. And I don't like the book, and I'm not even going to defend it, but it's not triumphalist, at least. It's stupid in other ways, no doubt. But the
pretty resigned, if anything.
It feels like a very resigned tone. I agree.
A resigned kind of triumph, like, guess this is the best we got.
Yeah, he's like, living under liberal capitalism might suck, but living under the USSR would have been worse.
Yeah.
Which I think is probably actually true.
He's saying this is the best, but yeah, all those qualifiers, like, this is the best to fail so far. And now we have someone saying, well, it did fail. And so what does that mean? Should we look for something else?
Yeah, he really means best as in like least worst, I think, Fukuyama. Like, I don't think that he's like loves it. He's not like having a...
But it does seem to block the way of inquiry in that, you know, he's also saying that it's unlikely. In fact, we won't find anything better than this. Like, it's that kind of prognosticating point that makes it a little tough to swallow too, though.
It felt like he made no effort to think through alternatives in a serious way, that are different. Like, that's what it felt like. So I think that in terms
there's no point.
Well, because I think that what he was doing was really just comparing actually existing liberal democracy with actually existing attempts at alternatives, right? And on that grounds, it's like, yeah, sure. But he didn't do any work to be like, well, what could we imagine as not actually existing alternatives? And like, you know, he might just say, well, that wasn't my project, but still, it felt a bit overly defeatist, maybe, in that sense.
Well, we're giving you today an alternative.
Yeah, well, kind of.
Well,
also definitely a counterpoint to Fukuyama, but from the right.
We're going to have a new alternative, which is Christofascism. So conservatives, they're opposed to liberalism plus capitalism also, we have found. Although I found most of them don't really have any grasp of what capitalism is other than consumerism, which is, at least, you know, in the way we read it, that's not what capitalism is. You could have a consumeristic socialism without a contradiction. But anyway, they hate porn, they hate gay Disney, and the vague goal is some sort of world government that aristocratic Catholics run.
What they also hate, kind of to give the most, I don't know if this is the most generous read, but I would say, like, at least in what we read, there's very much a through line of hating the fact that there are not ideals for people to live up to that forces them to self-regulate or something like that. Like, so there's no like virtues, like cultural virtues that tell people that, like, basically that they should be ashamed if they're not, you know, if they're not pushing themselves somehow. And in their case, right, pushing themselves to be like good Christians or like, you know, family people. like norms that are somehow, you know, have actual coercive effect, even though they're just in the ether. So it's like a stronger account, like lamenting the loss of cultural values that actually have an effect where people feel ashamed if they don't live up to them.
And media is really important to them. Media is responsible for the decline in these great ideas that we used to have. So there's a lot of the conservative right trying to put out their own shit, but it doesn't survive the market ever because it's very bad.
I find the media is often like the source of all their problems and the material they use for evidence to make their arguments at the same time. It's like the very thing that is the problem is your evidence for why you're right. It's never, there's no analysis. It's very surface level.
Have you guys heard of Adrian Vermeule?
Yes. Common good conservatism. He's
a professor at Harvard Law School. His full name is Cornelius Adrian Comstock Vermeule.
That's like a Roman emperor.
Why do all these crazy conservatives have those crazy names? Like what was that guy from the blog?
Westington Charles Arthur III.
Yeah.
I'm one of the editors of this Deneen book. What was the name there? John M. Owen IV.
There you go.
Really? God.
They have a true history.
They love their trappings of aristocracy are rampant.
Yeah, I mean, these aren't waspy elites at all.
These are people tracing their nobility back to ancient times.
I guess they're probably Catholics, though, not wasps. I should correct myself.
Cornelius Adrian Comstock Vermeule is a convert. And the converts, they're scary, you know, because they get they're too excited.
They want to partake.
The Catholics that I know, basically raised Catholic, kind of lapsed, maybe went to Catholic school, don't really care anymore. But the converts are the ones you have to watch for.
Yeah, because they want to feast on that body of Christ.
The blood and the body.
This guy who's a Harvard professor, here's a direct quote. Catholics need to rethink the nation state. We have come a long way, but we still have far to go towards the eventual formation of the empire of Our Lady Guadalupe, and ultimately the world government required by natural law.
Wow.
And this is in a little pamphlet he put together about immigration priority that says America needs to start prioritizing importing Catholics so they can get their empire going here. And this means, quote, immigration from Canada will rightly become a rare and difficult event, at least if we do not count a small subset of Quebecois.
Wow. That's funny.
We're not allowed in. What about the Irish? I mean, we can...
Irish Catholics?
I'm fine getting rid of the Quebecois, but take your hands off our Irish.
I love the Quebecois. They're like, it's funny because I feel like the Quebecois are also simultaneously like the most subversive, even though they also are the most Catholic.
Because they're French.
Yeah.
I feel like there's a pretty strong presence of Huguenots in Canada too, which are they go back to Calvinists. They're Protestants. They're radical. I mean, if you go back and read like the 16th century Huguenot texts, they're like against tyranny and about rising up against they could be very radical. And they went through waves of persecution. All those religious, you hear about 16th century religious wars. Yeah, those are the Catholics fucking up the Protestants. A lot of times the Calvinists, because the Lutherans sort of got along with the Catholics.
Yeah, after England took over Canada from the French, they invited the Huguenots to get over here because they hoped that they could convert all the French Catholics in Quebec to Protestantism. It would just be easier to manage that way. But I think most of them ended up switching to speaking English.
It's because in 1685, King Louis the 14th said, all you got to convert to Catholicism or get the fuck out. And so they had to leave. The large expulsion of the Huguenot community, a lot of them eventually ended up in Canada.
Anyway, the Empire of Our Lady of Guadalupe is a terrifying prospect, but Yeah, you can be a professor at Harvard Law and still call for world government under the Catholic Church, which I'm saying again, we already tried it. Okay, it didn't work out.
Yeah, we have like it's almost like well, I think another term that some people call them is Catholic integralists.
Yeah. But a few of these guys want to hit the rewind button, and everyone else is like, we already saw what you did when you were in charge, okay? No one else wants the rewind.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I guess the point of my anecdote was that there's a lot of religious intolerance throughout history within Christianity. Obviously, not just between, Christianity and Islam and Judaism, but even within Christianity. And do we really want to go back to that sort of shit, like intolerance and persecuting this sect and that sect? And I mean, that this seems to be a not very historically aware kind of community of right-wing people. I mean, Deneen accuses most conservatives of just being like right-wing liberals, basically.
It's Deneen, and that's who we're reading, by the way. I don't think we've said that yet. Patrick Deneen.
Deneen. We're reading Deneen, and he accuses conservatives of being right-wing liberals. The major parties, liberals or Democrats or left-wing liberals, and then you have the Republicans or conservatives, right-wing liberals. They're all liberals.
Well, let's turn from Vermeule, the Christo-fascist in name and self-declared, to Deneen, who's a much more palatable version, but says more or less the same thing.
I mean, is definitely moving, appeals to a similar sentiment and is moving towards a similar direction. But I don't think that he would be as I don't think he would say anything like as crazy as those quotes, at least not publicly.
Not publicly. This is so palatable that Obama put this on his reading list. And it's a big point of pride that Why Liberalism Failed is on Obama's reading list.
He said it's a very important book, but I don't agree with the conclusions, but the problems he identifies we should take very seriously, something like that.
Yeah, the blurb on the back is Why Liberalism Failed offers cogent insights into the loss of meaning and community that many in the West feel, issues that liberal democracies ignore at their own peril.
If nothing else, this at least invalidates all of Barack Obama's reading recommendations, because this book was totally inane.
I mean, it was a little disturbing.
If we can summarize, or if I can summarize, it's there's a word that's used for it that doesn't make that much sense to me, but it's supposed to be a communitarian text, which is it's a critique of liberal individualism, especially. But communitarian makes me think like there's some sort of redistribution, but this is more like family values communitarianism. And I guess the point of the book is, remember when we all used to go to church on Sunday? Wasn't that so good? Remember? Do you remember the Renaissance? Wasn't that good?
Yeah, or remember family values when, families were the basic unit, and the sacred bonds of familial relations, the sacredness of marriage, the sacred right of childbirth. Everything is so trad and fucking predictable with the actual value. The critiques, okay, fine. I agree with the shit he's complaining about with liberalism, but then all that other stuff is just so predictable.
Well, the reason why I thought it was maybe worth taking a look at was, well, first of all, I just thought that there'd be funny stuff in there for us to laugh at potentially. Like when he just complains and whines about porn and consumerism and family values. But I also think that what's interesting to me about it is that he does appear to offer a diagnosis of many factors that I think a lot of people on the left wouldn't disagree with. It's not anything new in a certain sense, but it's also interesting to hear it from a right-wing perspective, like a kind of non-capitalist and non-free market libertarian right-wing. And look, he does have some influence. I think I was looking on YouTube just to see who he's been talking to lately, and he actually had he's been on panels with J.D. Vance, who's now a U.S. senator, right? So it's just this shit's influencing influencing people. And I think, I mean, you know, especially the economic critiques in here, right? Like he just says stuff that most, I feel like left-leaning people would agree with, just not agree with the framing, right? So, you know, here's a quote where he's talking about economics in the intro. He says, civic unhappiness is mirrored in economic discontent. Citizens are more likely to be called consumers, yet the liberty to buy every imaginable consumer good does little to assuage the widespread economic anxiety and discontent over waxing inequality. Indeed, the assumption by economic leaders seems to be that increased purchasing power of cheap goods will compensate for the absence of economic security and the division of the world into generational winners and losers, right? I mean, this is like a pretty typical like social democratic left, you know, complaint, right?
Yeah.
So now I think it's scary to me that there's some right wingers who are getting onto this message. And the reason it's scary to me is because I think it could be appealing to some people, that kind of message. Now, a more optimistic read of that is like, well, there's now opportunity, you know, the more pragmatist optimist side of me is like, well, if there's more people in the Republican Party who buy into that kind of message, maybe there could be some coalition over policy between like some Democrats and some Republicans in terms of just economic issues. But we're obviously not here to talk about like real politics, but I just thought I would mention that. So it's scary because it could attract more voters to people like this and you know, steal away whatever we would call the working class even more from left-leaning politicians. But I mean, not that there really are any real left-leaning politicians
I feel
anymore,
like
but
this stuff has been like in its audience test screening phase for a little while, and now it's being launched as like a rhetorical platform. And for, you know, I agree with what Victor was saying. And it's like, if you find yourself like either to the left or to the right of sort of the mainstream, maybe political positions, then maybe you do have similar critiques. But I mean, like, for example, I've said things that he's said before, that he's said in here. I've said these things before, like the liberals and the conservatives, the Democrats and the Republicans. They're not really that much different. They're two different positions within a generally very similar framework. But I don't agree with the motives.
and he has some environmentalist stuff in here too.
Yeah. Global warming is caused by liberalism. Actually, everything bad that has ever happened is caused by liberalism.
Yeah, like liberal capitalism.
Well, he also thinks capitalism is caused by liberalism, which I think, okay, but the more compelling case, especially for a material history, is to reverse those two. But then again, when he says capitalism, he just means consumerism. So consumer side, they have too many options. They have a bunch of choices, and that's what gets made and sold.
Yeah, like I feel like the left has made a lot of these critiques, and now they're being like almost audience tested and given like a right-wing spin. And now if you find yourself to the right of the mainstream discourse, well, here we have some ideas for you, right? Hey, they've been purged of their Marxist and their anarchist and their leftist libertarian content. Here they are. Are you Catholic? Perfect. You're already halfway fucking there then. I mean, if you're not a left-wing Catholic.
This is like a cartoonish critique of liberalism. And, you know, I fucking hate this guy. For nothing else, he's making me carry water for liberalism. But everything bad that has ever happened, he names liberalism, which is kind of like the other guy saying, Eric Vogelin, another one of these Catholic right wings. Everything that has ever happened that's bad is because of Gnosticism.
Early modern.
Right.
Started with Hobbes and Locke.
This is kind of also the thing that you'd hear from a Twitter Marxist saying, you know, liberalism is responsible for everything bad that has ever happened in my life.
Exactly.
So this is true horseshoe theory.
Yes, it's a taste of horseshoe theory right here.
And he's saying, you know, the classical liberals turned into conservatives, and the progressive liberals of the sort of later wave of liberalism, the second wave liberalism from like kind of Enlightenment times, are, you know, they're what the modern progressivist liberals came from. So you have the liberal tradition splitting into these two sides. You have like John Locke and Hobbes on one side, and then I forget some of the examples of the other one, like Francis Bacon.
Yeah, he talks about Machiavelli a little bit too, I think.
Machiavelli,
as being the start of,
Rousseau.
as being kind of like the first modern, because he because he kind of gave up. He was the first to give up on the idea of like leaders acquiring virtue or whatever, and like just like it's all about interests, right?
I'm
The individualist liberals and the statist interventionist liberals, they're like the classicals and the progressives.
I'm so fucking tired of idealist history. So for all this whining about postmodernism killing meta narratives, postmodernism evidently didn't do a very good job of it, because one of these stupid and Obama-endorsed books comes out every single year. I think we should. I'm just going to ban them right here. We're banning idealist histories. No one is allowed from now on to attribute causation to John Locke ever again. And you're not allowed. This is my number one rule. You're not allowed to write about Plato, Locke, Machiavelli, and Schmidt in the same book.
One of his proofs that the left and the right, in terms of like the mainstream parties, aren't so different is like one of his proofs is like a white liberal Southerner is likely to be more comfortable revealing political outlooks to a black Northern Democrat than to a white conservative in his neighborhood. A progressive homosexual and a liberal Christian will quickly recognize commonalities. He does these kinds of, he has this argument. It's this argument that, you know, the individualists, the methodological individualists and the methodological collectivists or the statists, they're not so different. These fake differences between the Republicans and the liberals, I guess the moderate Republicans and the moderate liberals, these fake differences are overblown. They're really not so different.
And I do want to say, we have to keep in mind this was published by Yale University Press. Yale is a very distinguished institution. They never get anything wrong. They're very thorough with their editing.
Solid scholarship.
You know who else went to Yale was a Bronze Age pervert.
Really?
Yeah, he was a PhD student in political theory at Yale, and then he dropped out. But yeah,
Bronze Age mindset is just kind of the explicit version of this book. This book is written for polite society.
We tend to put the Ivy Leaguers on a pedestal, and it's all about paying that tuition and taking the right bird courses like any other university in existence.
If we can go through some of these examples, like just his overall broad, what is liberalism? Liberalism is individualism. Now, is it wrong? Not totally. Is it right? Certainly not.
Yeah, I mean,
so liberalism for him is something that was invented to stop wars that were caused by religion.
Yeah.
And I want to just say, as anyone who has ever played Europa Universalis knows, the wars of religion were only peripherally about religion. There were Protestant states and Protestant leaders and Catholic states and duchies, whatever. But the stuff that caused those wars is the stuff that has always caused wars, which is, hint, hint, not really religion. It's control of territory, all this stuff. Because if his hypothesis were true, then it would suggest that Christians weren't killing each other before the Reformation, including like what? Bro, you ever heard of the 100 Years' War?
Yeah. Was there maybe there was some sort of sense of unity that was lost when there was, I mean, but like think about the papal schism that happened in the late Middle Ages. There was a maximum of 3 popes at one point. At the height of it, there were 3 popes, or 2 popes and 1 anti-pope, or something like that. Well, the papacy was moved back and forth between Rome and Avignon. You know, the northern monarchs were getting involved and marching armies down. I mean, it was still, Christendom was a mess even before Luther banged his theses onto the wall of a church, as legend has it, his 95 theses, because someone was coming around collecting money for indulgences in order to fund the papal building of the Renaissance Roman churches, and another northern leaders also trying to buy a electorate seat, and all this weird nonsense. Luther was very crotchety about that stuff. But the point is, yeah, Christendom was a mess even before Luther came along, and Calvin.
Yeah, and I do want to hedge what I just said. It's not to say that religion had no historical efficacy during this period. Clearly it did. But if I'm looking for causation, I'm not going to start with what everyone says that they were doing, the reason for these wars and the reasons for these schisms. But if you take his analysis seriously, it's that everything was fine until liberalism showed up with its fancy new version of freedom, and then everything started to disintegrate that was just fine before.
Well,
no, because liberty changed its meaning completely in the early modern era. That's his idea. Like liberalism, he does this like sort of etymological argument. You know, liberty used to mean cultivating yourself and educating yourself,
being responsible to the others, to the community.
Like the ancient Greek concept of paideia and the Roman concept of humanitas, like that was what liberty meant.
I have it right here, actually. The Greeks especially regarded self-government as a continuity from the individual to the polity, with the realization of either only possible if the virtues of temperance, wisdom, moderation, and justice were to be mutually sustained and fostered. Self-governance in the city was possible only if the virtues of self-governance governed the souls of the citizens, and self-governance of individuals could be realized only in a city that understood that its citizen itself was a kind of ongoing habituation in virtue, both through law and custom.
Which everyone believed, because everyone was fucking literate and everyone was sitting down and reading Aristotle.
Yeah, every
just the citizens, of course.
Every last peasant, every last person.
And this is the Greeks, by the way, the Greeks that killed Socrates.
Yeah, the slave society.
This is one of the problems with ideal history and writing like this, is because it's taken to be widespread, but at any given time, like 12 people believe this.
Well, yeah, you take a class on this stuff, you learn, like, you know, even the Renaissance, which started in Italy and spread around Europe, blah, blah, blah. But it was like the upper crust of nobility. It was a very, very limited, elitist, and exclusive movement. And it took a long, long, long time for those ideas to really spread to throughout all society. And even then, most people were very unaffected by Renaissance ideas.
Let me just like maybe provisionally defend a little bit ideal history here, only in this way, which is, I guess I agree with you completely that it's like who was actually even living up to this or like had this strong idea. But I think, isn't it worth just looking at, like, I mean, even today, right? Like, what would our ideal history be here, right? It'd be like self-realization, you know, like find yourself, be your true self. But it's like, who's actually living up to that, right? Everyone's fucking miserable. No one's actually themselves, right? But still, the fact that that's the ideal tells us something about that society, right? And so if you look back and go, it's like, yeah, sure, no one was living up to that ideal. But what does the fact that that's how, you know, the writers and poets of the time were self-describing the ideals? I guess, I'm not saying I agree with his thesis about how he puts all these pieces together, but it still seems somewhat valuable to me.
Yeah, like if you want to learn about why the American government is the way it is and who the founding fathers were reading, then yeah, go back and read Montesquieu and go back and read The Spirit of the Laws. Where did the separation of powers come from? Oh, and then you got to go all the way back to Locke, because he's the one who's originally talking about the separation of the legislative and the executive. You don't get the separation of the judicial until a bit later, but you get that, like, you know, a history of ideas is very different from an idealized kind of history.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, that's the distinction.
I want to talk about Locke for a second. Because Deneen hates Locke because Locke is apparently a theorist of individual license, which is, you know, not the impression
Individualist.
Not the impression I get from reading him.
And a voluntarist. That's the problem too. He's a voluntarist.
Because it's bullshit, right? The Two Treatise of Civil Government, it was written at the same time as the Glorious Revolution, which was when what was it? A Catholic was inheriting the throne to become the ruler of a mostly Protestant country. And then Parliament was like, yeah, that's not going to happen. We want a Protestant. So they invited William of Orange over, and William of Orange comes over to rule. And the Two Treatises, was Locke actually in the Parliament when this shit was happening, or was he just around for it?
I don't know.
I'm not sure exactly where he was.
He was in the Parliament at one time, right?
I think he was. Let me look it up.
Okay, anyway, Locke basically puts this conflict into political philosophy terms that says, no, there should be a separation of powers, mainly so that the king can't just decide to arbitrarily dissolve parliament at any time, because they had a Catholic inheritor of the throne. I don't really know how that happened, but the parliament was like, yo, we don't want a Catholic up in here. But if you listen to Deneen, Locke's only concern was advancing liberalism so that it could eventually invent porn, so that Locke would have something to jack off to. Like, his favorite Locke quote is that liberty is the freedom to satisfy our appetites. And I don't know where he's getting this quote from. I didn't even care enough to go and find out where it comes from, because this is not really Locke. This is unlike Locke to be like, oh yeah, let's let individual appetites run rampant.
Yeah.
We're not dealing with Rousseau in this case. Rousseau might have said something like that, but definitely not Locke. So this whole story of Locke being like, oh yeah, we need to have appetites immediately fulfilled. We need to destroy community and the past and history. No, Locke was dealing with a concrete situation in front of his face, which is, get a little Marxist here, it's a class conflict between the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy. The bourgeoisie, in trying to write their texts, form their organizations, including parliament, so that they could say, no, we're going to curtail you. You're not going to be able to just dissolve us whenever you want because of religious differences. So the whole motivation that Deneen has for presenting Locke in this way, it's complete bullshit. It's like you read sections of this in an anthology in an undergrad course, and then you're allowed to go write a book about it.
Well, his upshot of Locke is that Locke had this voluntarism to him, which, quote, ultimately affects all relationships, including familial ones. You get a little what Deneen is like upset about liberalism erasing. So like one of these familial, eroding of familial bonds and ultimately community bonds. He says Locke, the first philosopher of liberalism, on the one hand acknowledges in the second treatise that the duties of parents to raise children and the corresponding duties of children to obey spring up from the commandment, honor thy father and mother. But he further claims that every child must ultimately subject his inheritance to the logic of consent, right? So consent, it has to be consensual. It's choice now. It's choice theory. It's voluntarism. And he says Locke, though he didn't fully endorse this, he planted the seed of this idea that would bloom into full-blown, liberal voluntarism, individualism, where, if you want to, break the contract, the social contract with your family, go ahead. With your community, go ahead. With your church, go right ahead. You don't feel like you get along anymore. You want to get out of your marriage, that's a social contract. Just break it, because it devolves down to the people anyway. So just break it. It's a logic of consent that liberalism is going to be based on, that Locke originally planted the seeds of. That's kind of where Locke goes. Even marriage, quote, Locke holds, is finally to be understood as a contract whose conditions are temporary and subject to revision. He does, like, Deneen hates this idea. I get that he hates this idea. Like, marriage should lock you in, especially if you're a woman, you can't leave. And family, like, the father should be able to kill the child if he wants. He never says that, but I mean, it's so.
No, he definitely doesn't say that, and I think he would say that for sure, that the men should be held to the same responsibility. But yeah,
I'm being obvious. I'm being ridiculous.
He says in schools, norms of modesty, comportment, and academic honesty are replaced by widespread lawlessness and cheating, along with increasing surveillance of the youth. While in the fraught realm of coming of age, courtship norms are replaced by hookups and utilitarian sexual encounters. The norm of stable lifelong marriage is replaced by various arrangements that ensure the autonomy of the individuals, whether married or not. Children are increasingly viewed as a limitation upon individual freedom, which contributes to liberalism's commitment to abortion on demand, while overall birth rates decline across the developed world.
Yeah, now this is his theme of self-interest, which brings along with it this kind of rampant immorality. Now, this rampant immorality, where students used to be very, they used to be very ethical. They didn't cheat. They didn't hook up. Now they do because of you fucking liberals, especially
Yes.
Locke starting all this shit where nothing matters anymore. It's all about self-interest. Like this was Hobbes too, right? You start in a state of nature, you're this self-interest, isolated, atomic individual, and everything's about desire for power, which is, yeah, okay, that's what Locke says, and then, or Hobbes says, and then we give up those rights, we bestow them upon a sovereign if we can contract with others who are seeking peace, which is what reason tells us to do. Otherwise, we're in a state of nature where, you know, life is nasty, brutish, and short, and it's a war of all against all.
This is what, like, conservative Christian history is not history. Like, no one had extramarital sex until Locke wrote the 2 treatises of civil government.
Yeah, like the social contract theory runs all the way up to Rawls too, in that experiment.
To be as generous as I can to his view, I think what he would probably say is, yeah, of course people didn't live up to the norms. And actually, this isn't a very generous interpretation now that I think about it before I say it. But like, what matters is that you had grounds to shame people who broke those before, right? Which would which is more likely to lead to conformity. So the problem isn't so much that, oh, there was a time when no one was hooking up. What was good was that it was regulated by the shame that everyone would publicly impose on those people. Now liberalism, with its like laissez-faire attitudes, means that no one has to feel ashamed about it anymore. And now, therefore, it's less regulated.
Yeah. And he paints like a nice picture of, I mean, he says very clearly, he says, you know, we cannot go back to a pre-liberal era. But you do get a sense of this enormous amount of nostalgia for what liberalism has erased. So he'll say things like, you know, a pre-liberal era dismissed the idea that it's not that they dismissed the idea of individual free choice. It's not that they didn't believe in individual free choice, but pre-liberal Christianity contributed to an expansion of human choice in the sense that they transformed the idea of marriage from an institution based on familial and property considerations. Now, here's the bad part. The new liberalism made it into a choice made by consenting individuals on the basis of sacramental love. Liberalism now gets rid of this nice pre-liberal picture of marriage. So what's new now is that the default basis for evaluating institutions, society, affiliations, memberships, and personal relationships is dominated by the calculation of individual self-interest, not the beautiful sacramental love, but self-interest, without the broader consideration of the impact of one's choices on the community, one's obligations to the created order, and ultimately to God. We forget about those things and we act on self-interest.
He kind of sums it up when he says, you know, on 41, liberalism was thus a titanic wager that ancient norms of behavior could be lifted in the name of a new form of liberation, and that conquering nature would supply the fuel to permit nearly infinite choices. The twin outcomes of this effort, the depletion of moral self-command and the depletion of material resources, make inevitable an inquiry into what comes after liberalism.
Yeah, and that's the separation from nature theme, where, you know, you have Francis Bacon, who Hobbes was a secretary for,
which I didn't know until I reread this, actually, I guess, because I had read this before and I forgot that fact. I didn't know that. Did you guys know that before? I didn't know that.
I didn't know that they were even alive at the same time.
Yeah. I must have. Yeah. It was something. I'm not saying I still learn things from reading these kinds
of
texts.
Sure. That goes without saying. I mean,
and Francis Bacon, you know, he's got these famous sayings about nature. Does he say nature is like a woman and we have to torture her to get her secrets out or something like that? Like, basically, you know, this idea that nature is something we have to conquer, master.
Machiavelli says the same thing about Fortuna, and then Nietzsche says something similar about truth or something like that.
Beaten into submission, the gendered metaphors. Yeah, Fortuna is a woman and needs to be beaten into submission. Virtue
needs to be held down and struck.
So we got something like a thesis. My thesis that I pulled out of his book is, quote, the breakdown of family, community, and religious norms and institutions, especially among those benefiting least from liberalism's advance, has not led liberalism's discontents to seek a restoration of these norms, meaning like, I don't know, medieval norms, Greek norms. And then continuing, these would take effort and sacrifice in a culture that now diminishes the value of both. So there's obvious nostalgia, terrible historiography and nostalgia, which we've all agreed upon. And then what does he want out of this? It's not found in this book, but it might be relevant to mention just so we can see what he's going for. He wrote a book called Regime Change, and he terms Aristo-populism, which is we reinstitute hierarchy, and we have some sort of cultural elites that craft, policy in line with the common good. And the common good, it's a very old idea from not just the Greeks, but the Christians taking up the Greeks. The elites are going to form this common good for everyone else. Even if we don't get there, it's the thing that we're aiming at. Whereas liberalism is to blame for porn and TikTok and climate change and
everything.
Climate change, like we just said, climate change is liberalism just disrespecting nature.
Yeah, the mastery of nature, the separation from nature, the disrespect.
I just wanted to say that, I don't think that these views are, they wouldn't be appealing to anyone if there wasn't at least something in them that people would latch onto that is appealing. And I would say that for me, the one thing that I find like appealing, well, I don't even know if appealing about the whole view, because I don't find his conclusions appealing. But one of the observations, and I mean, it's true, we've already said that there's critiques that he makes in here that, are old critiques that leftists have made for a long time, right, about the economy.
Yeah, you could just call it alienation, except they would, of course, disagree on the
Yeah, exactly.
Cause.
Exactly. But the one thing that I think maybe is like that right-wingers have more of a tendency to bring in than like left-wing theorists is, it's actually in the quote that I read earlier about the moral, the depletion of moral self-command. So this question of like self-command, self-mastery, like I will say that that's something that I often find left theorists have a harder time to have a vocabulary about. Like it's just something that I think is important. And I think all of us have experienced those moments when we push ourselves to do something that matters to us, that requires a tremendous amount of self-mastery. And like the meaningful upshot from that is just like so much more than just some hedonic, resort time when you're at a resort. Like the satisfaction you get from pushing yourself to do something, to discipline yourself, I think surpasses, any sort of like whatever, how he describes voluntary like hedonism, right? Like I think that's true. And I think that so that's like just talking about that, having a vocabulary to talk about that and talk about why it's bad to not have that somehow, or not have some source of where to find that. I mean, I think there's something to that, is all I'm saying. Now, of course, I think it's scary to talk about that. And I think there's good reasons why the left doesn't want to talk about that, insofar as, whatever we would bunch up with left theorists, is because, I mean, it does sort of require, well, who's going to tell us what the right thing to self-master is, right? And then that becomes scary. That's when you get fascism and shit like that, right? So I don't even know if it's a solvable problem, but I just think like that's true. Like I think that's a true fact of whatever we would call human nature, that, when we are some masters of ourselves, or we have that sense, some of the most meaningful times in your life, right? I think that's just true.
If they got their way, there's some sense that they want this to be law.
Well, that's what's scary, exactly.
For him, liberalism is simply, and this is incorrect, by the way, liberalism deserves to be critiqued, but not on these grounds, because liberalism for him is just the greatest possible freedom from external constraints, which it wasn't, because the primary purpose of liberalism and the environment that it came out of was to limit the abuses and arbitrariness of public political power.
Correct.
This is why the rule of law is put ahead of, any individual head of government, or the rule of
or even
merit.
ahead of democracy.
Yeah, merit instead of birth. These kinds of things. But the alienation stuff, I think that's where this purchase is, and I agree that I'm never gonna have a solution to that. And we kind of see this with the manosphere stuff. It's like be
Exactly.
like this, be like me, follow this, which is never something that I'd be willing to say.
Yeah, exactly.
If you look at the history of political thought and what the theorists were saying and arguing with each other about, you have, say, during the 18th century, the idea of the spirit of the people or the collective will, right? For Locke and Hobbes, they were more on the side where the collective will was really just like the sum of individual wills. Like if you look at the picture of the Leviathan, it's really just made up of a bunch of people, if you look closely. And then the French actually had a more of a collectivist kind of spirit of the people, spirit of the laws, the collective will, which kind of stood over and above people. And fascists and totalitarians were just as much a fan of Rousseau as Democrats were, because Rousseau, you could read him to say he wants a kind of aristocracy that would tell the people what was best for them. Like, you don't really know what's best for you. Because there's the collective spirit, the collective will, and that stands over all of us. And we're going to be the people who tend to this spirit and help it along by making the right laws that guide it and allow you to flourish within this context. And that has led to ideas on totalitarian left-wing kinds of things, right? And now we see a kind of right-wing version of that kind of emerging as if it's something completely fresh and new and religious, and it's like has the trappings of a return to ancient Greek and early Christian kinds of values, and it's all nice like that. But you got to admit that the problem is, this, what do we do about this sort of collective spirit that stands over each of us? If we're not going to be individualists, right, then what are we going to do with that idea where there's the collective spirit? It's more than just the sum of all of our wills, right? We seem to not know how to deal with that problem. So we're stuck in this kind of, I mean, he points it out here, like individualists versus statists, right? State intervention or laissez-faire, right? Like, should we allow our healthcare to be sorted out by the free market, or should the state deal with it? But in either case, it's really not, this collective will.
Yeah, it's a back and forth. These conservatives are resigning. They just don't want to think anymore. They want someone to take on the burden of thinking from them. And they don't want anyone else to think anymore either. So what do? We go back to a time when there was, in their view, no debate over individual versus collective will. They want, in their own brain, in their own big other, an ideological straw man to tell them what to do. So they read a 2,000-year-old book and decide that that is the answer for all time. And for some, that 2,000-year-old book is the Bible. For others, it's Aristotle's Ethics. But in truth, there never was a time when there was no debate over individual and collective will.
Yeah.
That's like the fabrication that's piecemealed together. The bad history is that this debate about liberty just in the context of Locke is we need to get power out of the hands of these corrupt, hedonic tyrants or just totally incompetent idiots. The liberty is not like we want to do whatever we want. It's like these people actually suck and they keep sucking. And Deneen talks about Aristotelian liberty and then leaves out all the insane shit that his holy church did. Like just the Crusades. How about that one? The Spanish Inquisition. I mean, I'm as critical as liberalism as the next guy, but I prefer that to anyone who believes that witches are real.
Yeah, you got to take the good with the bad. You can't really just cut out all the nasty parts and say, look, here's this sort of great thing we should sort of aim at in the future, not return to, but sort of reestablish a kind of self-governing sort of education where students are gonna sort of just on their own stop cheating, or, romantic relationships are going to be non-utilitarian, not like pleasure-oriented, but like more, I don't know how, like sacred, I guess. Like, I don't know how you would, if I'm not really a religious person and I'm kind of okay with people, whether they want to choose not to get married or not, well, I'm a voluntarist now. I'm a fucking liberal, so I can't say that. And then it's difficult to see myself in this kind of perspective, to say the least. But I agree with what Victor was saying too. I do like the sort of the classical pre-liberal sense of liberty he's talking about. It's not the worst thing in the world.
He also blames liberalism is responsible for the emancipation of women, which is, quote, children are increasingly viewed as a limitation upon individual freedom, which contributes to liberalism's commitment to abortion on demand.
Yeah, that's what I read earlier, I think.
Yeah, that's almost like negative enlightenment.
Materially, this is not liberalism that was just like, hey, women, here's all your rights. Like, otherwise there wouldn't be women fighting for rights. You can blame, maybe I'm just doing the same thing from the other side here, but you can blame capitalism for that, because it's like the profits, the rate of profits falling, but we got all these workers that are just sitting at home taking care of their babies. Why don't we get them into the business factory?
I mean, I think he wouldn't. I mean, my sense is he wouldn't actually disagree with that analysis. I don't think he said it, at least in the parts that we read. But I mean, I think that he does see like the economic liberalism as, another side of the same coin. So I think he'd be like, yeah, of course, that's the part of liberalism that led women to do that. And then
the solution, I guess, the end point of this is really the scary part. You just you want
regime change,
theocracy. You want Baron Trump to be the next guy. I don't know if Baron Trump's a bad ruler, but this is the point of liberalism. You don't know if the kid's going to be good or bad, right? It could be it's a coin flip. Whereas if you have some electoral process, at least there's a chance that there's like meritocracy involved as opposed to the divine right of kings. And that's at least in theory what democracy is supposed to be able to do.
No, he says at the end, he says here, these are his 3 steps, not going back, but actually acknowledging the achievements of liberalism and building on them. That's his first. And then the next one is outgrowing the age of ideology. So he thinks we're going to go post-ideological. So there's almost an end of history kind of thing here. If you take the end of history to mean history of the capital H, post-ideology, but just not liberalism is the best. But he wants to go, of the 3 great modern ideologies, only the oldest and most resilient remains. And that's, I guess, the early Christian tradition going back to the pre-modern definition of liberty. And the liberals ruined all that. Okay. And then, a better theory of politics and society might ultimately emerge that eschews liberalism's ideological dimensions, but again is cognizant of its achievements.
Sounds like Marx.
Well, in his new book, I think he talks more about, I think you called it aristocratic populism.
Aristo-populism, yeah.
And I think that he has in mind, I know that he talks a lot about the mixed regime. And I think like the Aristo-populism would probably be that you have, these aristocrats at the top who then are like responsive to popular demand, but are still also somehow setting, norms. I'm not exactly sure how, but I haven't read the other books. So
it's post-liberalism infused with orthodox religious traditions.
That sounds really easy. Why don't we just get it done?
Yeah, let's get it done.
Let's just push it through. Push it through.
Remember when everyone went to church on Sunday?
If people would just sort of have this sort of self-governed liberal arts education where they learn how to be moral and, bring back honor and virtue as kind of an ideal, then we wouldn't need this whole state apparatus, this ridiculous giant state apparatus, and this interminable argument between individualists and statists, freedom from or freedom through laws. Like he's like, what's that all about? But to me, that just seems like almost like a kind of panopticon argument. He wants you to internalize all of that sort of moral baggage And it kind of reminds me of Foucault's chapter on the panopticon in Discipline and Punish. He who is subjected to the field of visibility and who knows it assumes responsibility for the constraints of power. He makes them play spontaneously upon himself. He inscribes in himself the power relation in which he simultaneously plays both roles. He becomes principle of his own subjection. By this very fact, the external power may throw off its physical weight. It tends to the non-corporeal, and the more it approaches this limit, the more constant, profound, and permanent are its effects. It is a perpetual victory that avoids any physical confrontation and which is always decided in advance. And that's what Deneen wants. He wants to put little fucking panopticons, which ironically is something Bentham dreamt up. And ironically, Bentham is the one who made this distinction between positive and negative liberty that Deneen is not acknowledging, but he's just kind of reinventing this wheel from a conservative right-wing Catholic side.
Liberalism is responsible for everything bad except for the parts I'm going to plagiarize and present as my own.
Wow.
So so this is quoting from his new book. He says, what is needed is the application of a Machiavellian means to achieve Aristotelian ends. The use of powerful political resistance by the populace against the natural advantages of the elite to create a mixed constitution in which genuine common good is the result. And Aristo-populism is, this is from a book review. He says, it's a pie-in-the-sky blending of working-class populism with a classically educated and conservative new nobility inculcated with the civic virtue needed to assure a politics of the common good.
So like a political priesthood.
Oh, this sounds amazing. This sounds like a great society we should try, where a bunch of uppity Christian liberal arts college graduates with 3 names get to approve any new films being made or which TV shows come out. Because, conservatives have a great and proven track record of making really good art and music and film.
He actually has some concrete policy recommendations as well. So he's worried about like the mixing of class. So he recommends much smaller districts for representation. As America's long ago anti-federalist. So, because right now I think there's only 400 and something. They're giant districts. He thinks that like they should be much smaller to have more local representation. He thinks that you should move the nation's capital around the country, as Rousseau apparently recommended. He thinks that there should be mandatory national service for the youth. You should break up the tech and social media monopolies. Break up those monopolies into smaller companies. And revise university admissions processes and replace racial and sexual affirmative action with working class affirmative action.
Hey, man, if that's all, I'm on board with all of that, except for the one, what was it, the Hitler Youth clause?
Yeah, I know. None of that.
But other than that sounds not too bad.
Sure, let's do it. But yeah, I know. Then the real politic comes along and says, well, how are we going to do that without completely violating the basic liberal constitutional values?
But I think there's some sleight of hand here with what working class means for Deneen. Like, I think that could be a little bit of sleight of hand, like, because at one point it's like national, foreign, industrial, economic, and social policies need to prioritize working class and promote traditional mores, right? So like that's where you get some smuggling in of stuff. And actually a good example, which I know Deneen is a fan of this, is what Viktor Orban's been doing in Hungary with family policy. So like, for example, in Hungary, if you're a woman and you have 4 or more children, you never have to pay taxes again in your life to incentivize more like family formation and reproduction.
So ultimately, it just seems to be just the morals that he wants, that he likes, the values that should be inculcated, like, economic, equality and material distribution. Those are secondary to family values and Christian values. It's almost like a right-wing Chomsky with the anarcho-syndicalism as the end.
Well, the biggest fear, obviously, for anyone who is not a Catholic, Christian, liberal arts student is what he means by norms and customs and how norms and customs are going to be enforced. Because again, like what we started out with, they're certainly obsessed with the media. So we'll probably get some sort of new Hays Code, all that kind of stuff. But then how are the rest of what he calls the constraints upon individual choice? How are any of those going to be imposed?
Well, so he does say, apparently in the new book, he talks about eliminating the separation of church and state. So because right now
there you go.
It's strict. So he thinks that like it should be allowed to like, have some more that's where the integration, right? The integralism comes. It's like integrating religion into like state institutions.
So if we have these like small districts that he's talking about, you can have like a Catholic district, but then presumably you would have a non-Catholic district too, right? You could have
I think so.
You'll have some Mormon ones. You'll have some.
I think so. Exactly.
You'll have the atheist coastal elites,
and that's why he would say that's why he would still say like there's going to be diversity. There's going to be like different stuff. It's just going to be more localism, right? To where like more insular localism.
You know who had localism and who never had any internal conflict? The Holy Roman Empire.
Yeah.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Let's just rewind.
Or the original papal states. And the Pope was the head of state and government. There is no distinction there.
So he just wants to balkanize America up into like duchies based on quote unquote norms and customs. I'm down to see it. Let's go. I
mean, that is, and you know what? There is actually hints of that. I don't know if any of you noticed, but like there is hints of it in the Why Liberalism Failed book, because he mentions a couple of times, pretty early in the book, I think he says that like the only realistic thing is kind of like resistance at the local level or something. He kind of talks about how like you can build your own communities at the local level. And I think that he would want to see a regime change that sort of enforces or creates the conditions for that local resistance to be more universalized across. I think you're right.
Hey.
I think you're right to say like, yeah, we would see like these little Mormon districts, these little like Catholic.
But he sounds like he's advocating for a labor organization. So we could also have like a little communist state. Try it out.
So is this the point where we make common cause with this movement, but we just sit back and say, well, it's not going to go the way they think it's going to go, but they're going to be useful. They're going to be useful idiots for us now.
That's exactly what I kind of meant at the beginning when I was saying the pragmatist side of me is like, if this becomes more of a popular way of going, there might be opportunities for like left-leaning politicians to ally themselves with on specific policies, like right that are like supportive of working class.
Like supposing we can alleviate some of the enormous burden that neoliberalism since the 80s has created, and a lot of this conflict goes away, then it's not going to go towards religious fundamentalism. It's going to go towards a open, non-nationalistic pluralism. So let's fucking do it. And it's going to go that way and not the way that these idiots think it's going to go. It's not going to go towards Orthodox, Christian, ancient Greek libertas. It's not going to go that way. But we'll just put that idea out for now. We'll just have that as the carrot and then we'll use that Machiavellian stick to push all the changes through. Break up capitalism, get rid of nationalism.
Break up the social media companies.
Yeah, get rid of the fucking tech monopolies, get rid of all the profit-driven bullshit that's ruining our education and our banking and our healthcare. Get rid of it all. And then, maybe we'll end up somewhere better than we started.
That is actually what I've heard some post-liberals talk about, that there is opportunity here for common cause. Like, who was it? God, I wish I could remember. Like, has publicly talked about it. He's like, I would love to ally with AOC on some stuff about, on like some working class stuff. But you know what? I think they're thinking the same thing that you're thinking on their end.
Yeah.
They're like, we'll use these left-wingers and then like...
Yeah, we'll use them to get the papal states back in order. This is exactly what Hobbes says in the Leviathan too. Everyone thinks they're smarter, in this state of nature, we are equal of mind. The dumbest human being and the smartest human being, there's not really that big a gap there. And the fact that everyone thinks that they're more intelligent than everybody else is a good sign that intelligence is pretty evenly distributed. So let's do it. Let's use each other.
You know how this would actually turn out, though? The Christofascists would not get their way, but neither would the leftists get their way. It would become the Baudrillardian states of America. where every state is run by an influencer and all their followers would move to their state. So you'd have the largest state, which would be Swifty Nation, the Tom Brady states, those would be pretty well populated. And
you'd have religious influencers
then you
running
have
other
the Jordan Peterson state. And then, Hassan Piker could have his own state. The incel state, which it doesn't matter because it would die out within one generation.
Yeah.
So you could just move geographically to the state that you want to live in and then see how it goes.
Yeah, if we could somehow facilitate border crossing and getting up and moving, you just go find the place that, reflects your values the best. And we might need a few underground railroads to get people out of places that want to prevent that sort of thing. Like if you have to do a Hobbesian kind of covenant to enter this place and then you can't break the contract, well, then we might have to get you out somehow. But otherwise, we'll have that.
Okay, I've been convinced. This sounds pretty good. We should try the influencer states of America. Everyone goes to the place that they agree, which already exists, but we're going to create it in geographical form.
I like it. That's it. I think
we figured it out.
End of history done.
We figured it out.
I didn't expect us to solve this, but I think we just did. The Balkanized Holy Roman Empire of the influencer states of America. Our political program, we endorse it going forward. Although, you know what? I'd be really afraid of the Trump state, because it would be probably the biggest and also the most willing to invade its neighbors. So I don't know.
Yeah, the Deneen Trump. I don't know if the Deneen state would be the same as the Trump state, but I'd be scared of both.
The Deneen state would have like 4 60-year-old elbow patch nerds in it. And then
that's true.
The Trump state would just immediately absorb it.
Reason teaches us that we shouldn't hurt each other. We are all God's creations, and we will band together and punish you if you break the first law that reason teaches us.
Yeah, they're like holding out a copy of Nicomachean Ethics, trying to convince the Trumpists not to invade them, and they just get run over by a whole bunch of monster trucks painted with American flags. It's our solution.
Your move, centrist establishment.
Yeah, the country's just descending into chaos because of state Trump. It's all on fire, and the politics nerds, they're all gathered in the Obama state, of course, and they're just like, it's so good that everyone has something to add to the conversation.
Your move, globalist elites.
We gotta thank John M. Owen IV for editing this series of books. I love these people. I love these people with like, I don't know, what's the name? Is there a name for like having a number at the end of your name? Like, what do they call that? Like
if there were, I wouldn't know what it was.
Yeah. It's so funny.
All right, guys. Good stuff. I'm glad we came to a conclusion here.
This is
that worked out well.
James Tate the First signing out.
Okay, thanks everyone for listening, and we'll catch you later.